This is Jim Bish with the Americans in Wartime Museum. Today's date is March 29, 2019, and I am conducting an interview with Ralph Reinke in Sun City, Arizona. Ralph, could you please give me your full name and where you were born?
Ralph Louis Reinke. I was born in Elmhurst, Illinois.
And did you grow up in Elmhurst,
I
Illinois?
grew up in Elmhurst. It was a community of maybe 20,000, a village of a sorts.
Yeah. And what war did you participate in?
World War II.
Thank you. So you grew up in Elmhurst. Did you graduate from high school there as well?
Well, almost. I left high school just as I was about to graduate because the Navy called me up. I had enlisted in the Navy and they called me up. And so I was not there for the ceremony, but they gave me the diploma anyway. So I am a high school graduate.
That's good. You were in high school that you graduated in 1942, you said?
44.
44, okay. So you were probably a freshman or so when
Sophomore.
Pearl Harbor happened.
Yeah, sophomore.
What do you remember about that day and the reaction?
We were at my uncle and aunt's house. I have the one boy cousin who was about a month older than I, and he and I were great friends. And we were sitting around chatting, and the news flash came over the radio that Pearl Harbor had been attacked. My uncle particularly knew what that meant. I don't know the rest of us did, other than it was announced that we were attacked. So it was a day that I do recall sitting there with my parents, my grandparents, and my uncle and aunt, and 3 cousins. So it was an event I shall not ever forget.
Yeah. Did your school change? Were there events in the school that changed as a result of that?
I don't recall. I really don't recall. I know that there was a big conversation the following Monday, but whether there was anything significant by way of program, I don't recall.
I'm sure it made a big impact, especially on the seniors that were in the school at the time.
In fact, many of them immediately were talking about leaving school to go. And of course, that would have been through the first semester. I don't remember that many of them left. I do know, though, that in the next year, that many students, before they graduated, had left, even as I did a few weeks early.
Yeah. So was your process then to go into the Navy? You said that you left school early.
I enlisted in the Navy in the PreFlight Program called the V5 program, which would involve a year of college and then the flight school. I think the Navy realized in 1944 that it would take 2 years to train a pilot, and they scrubbed the program. So I was sent to Great Lakes as a recruit. It was a very interesting company of recruits. There were about 20 of us from the western suburbs of Chicago, which were essentially pre-college, pre-prep programs. And we were in base there at Great Lakes for maybe a week or two, no, maybe a week. And they brought a second group into our company, so we were now 40. The second group came in from the hills of Ozarks, you should say the Ozarks somewhere. Kids who had grown up in ramshackle situations in poverty. And we were still only 2/3 full for our company. And about a week later, we were all, those of us who were a part of the company, assembled in a room, and chaplain came in, a couple of officers came in, and we received a lecture on tolerance. The Navy at that time was still segregated, and we were to be one of the first companies to have black people in our company. I remember walking back to the barracks, marching back to the barracks, and we got back to the barracks, and some of the lads from the hills of Virginia, West Virginia, said, "I'm not going to sleep with those people," and they used the derogatory N-word. And those of us who had taken, what shall I say, leadership positions in the company were frightened because we didn't want civil war to occur in our company. So the black kids came in, and they were a good-looking bunch of kids. They'd been obviously well selected to make sure that integration would work. And so lights went out, and we were fearful that some of the threats that we had heard might be carried out. And at that moment, a beautiful baritone voice sang the Lord's Prayer. Black kid by the name of Brown, we later learned, sang the Lord's Prayer. Whether he was put up to that, I don't know. But we had no trouble in that company in the next 8 weeks. And I think that single event of the Lord's Prayer being sung at Lights Out that first night when the blacks were with us cured the concern that we had about the problems of integration in the Navy.
That was a great story. So you were the first company that...
Supposedly, I don't know whether we were or not, but that's how we were told that we were experimental. But I have an afterthought, I'm sure that it was true, because the kids that they had put in us, the black kids they put in with us, were really good kids. I mean, they were athletes, they were clean, and it was just a good group of young men. And so we integrated very quickly with them without any problems.
Were they doing the same roles as you later on? And did you...
I didn't bump into any of them later on, because at that time, still in the Navy, active Navy, blacks were assigned kitchen duties. They were servants in the wardroom of the officers. They really were not integrated at all into the naval forces. So I didn't bump into many, and there were not that many that were in a position to be that. Black kids, I found out later, frequently went into the Army, were drafted into the Army, I should say, and where the Navy was a volunteer group.
Yeah. So was there anything unusual besides that in your basic training at Great Lakes?
Not really. It was just finished training and rode a troop train for 5 days to the West Coast and got on a ship, and 28 days later I was in the Philippines.
So you rapidly, after Great Lakes Training School, you were rapidly on the coast and out into the Pacific.
That's right. I was there within, I would guess, from the time I entered the Navy until the time I got in the Philippines was probably elapsed time, 3 months, if that.
What was your occupational specialty?
Well, I was enlisted to be a pilot, but because of good eyesight, they wanted to make me a controller on the big guns of a battleship. Well, they washed that out too, and they just sent me overseas, and I was attached to a CB unit in the southern Philippines off the island of Samar that was repairing LSTs, essentially, that had been damaged in previous invasions. A lot of those invasions occurred on the north shore of New Guinea. And then we went into LCVPs, the small landing craft that carry a dozen or two Marines. And I was being trained at last then to run one of those. In retrospect, I think they were probably training me to run one of those up on the shores of Japan, which of course the war ended and I didn't have to do that, thankfully. But basically we were repairing those ships. So it was a ship repair unit of the CBs off the coast of Samar, southern Philippines.
What time did you arrive at Samar? Do you remember what year that was and about what month?
Oh boy. I think it was the late fall of 44.
Okay. That probably sounds right, because you were still within, 9 months of the wars and all ending.
Yeah. And of course the war in the Philippines didn't really end until the war was over, because there were pockets of resistance. The Philippines, I think, had 200,000-300,000 Japanese soldiers, and so it was I got to know the Filipino people reasonably well, as you do as a sailor. They suffered terribly. They suffered at the hands of the Japanese in a way that no human being should suffer. I mean, it was criminal. And there were war trials, I think, ultimately, that made some of the officers, particularly officers, be punished for their war crimes.
Yeah, the Japanese were pretty brutal also to the Chinese coming through as well.
And Nantong, just severe kinds of thing. But I think that's not the characteristic of those people. I think the young Japanese man who went off into the service was trained to do that, and that was the way he was approached life, that he was a superior human being, and that all other human beings were subhuman species, to be treated almost as animals, and they did. I'm afraid they did.
Yeah.
They proceeded to do as they had been taught, and so I think that the fact that we were able to help the Japanese restore their country to a democratic type of government is a tribute to the U.S. government and to General MacArthur. I'm not a MacArthur fan, but on that end, I am a MacArthur fan.
Yeah. So your job then sounds like it was shoreside.
Well,
pretty much.
Never assigned to a ship. Oh, I was. I came back from overseas in June of 45 perhaps. And I thought I had enough points to be discharged because I had entered as a reserve. That was a year of service, plus the war years plus one was what I was enlisted for. And so I thought I had enough points to go home. Then they sent me up to Bremerton, Washington to help put a couple of ships into mothballs, which I think were then taken out of mothballs for Korea, and certainly if they were still available for Vietnam.
Yeah. So, were you evaluating LSTs and evaluating and getting them back into shape? That was your primary.
Well, we were particularly LSTs. The main bearing for the shaft is about a 6-inch steel shaft, and there were not ball bearings on it. There were lead bearings with rags to keep the water out. It was a pretty crude thing. They were not built to be long-lived. And these LSTs had made the trip from the U.S. over there. They were really not designed for that. They were designed for short hauls, but they had to get there. And so many of them, by the time they got there, they needed a lot of rags to keep the water from seeping in on the bearings. And so in the foundry, we were pouring the bearings. And we had a huge dry dock that had been shipped in piece by piece, and we were able to get these LSTs into a dry situation, pull the shaft, redo the shaft. A lot of it was that, and then there were holes, of course, bullet holes and shrapnel holes and that sort of thing that the welders took care of. So they made them serviceable, but I think essentially after one use, an LST is almost scrap iron because it's not built as a long-lasting ship.
Yeah. So were there other LST repair places throughout the islands, or were you the primary one for LSTs?
Well, there were two. There was one down in southern Philippines, also called Manakani Island, and there was another up at Subic Bay. And Subic Bay is a base that had been there pre-war, still there. Subic Bay, north of Manila, 70 miles or so, in a pretty fine bay for storing ships. So there's a ship repair unit there, and there was one in the southern Philippines.
Okay. And so at Samar, you were there primarily your entire time in the Pacific?
Most of the time, yeah. I did take one after we had repaired it up to Subic Bay, and I was in Subic Bay for a short period of time. But basically my service was there in Manakani Island off Samar in the southern Philippines.
And did you have much engagement with the Filipino people while you were there?
Quite a bit. I was very sensitive to them. In fact, when I left the service, I ultimately went into a teaching ministry with the Lutheran Church. And I think my sensitivity to those people was great. And I guess that's why I was able to know how severely they had suffered. It was tragic how women would sell themselves just to be able to feed their family and their kids. It was a terrible circumstance that they were living through as they tried to reestablish themselves as human beings after having been treated as animals. So my sensitivity to them. I did get back to the Philippines maybe 30 years ago for a brief visit with my first wife. I wanted her to see the place where I had spent the time and where she, as my high school sweetheart, had written many letters. Letters, of course, came in bunches because it was all sea mail. And so I think I'd get a package of 25 letters, and she got them the same way, punches of 25. And I'd take them down to a place where I sat regularly to read them, and she was able to see that place. Gratefully, she was able to survive that trip, and 6 months later she was in heaven. So it was a kind of a pleasant closure to that portion of my life.
Yeah, that was a good story. Had it changed tremendously in the 30 years since you'd been there?
Well, the chapel, the bench in front of the chapel was the same one I sat on, and that had been there for 35 years. And the chapel still had some Spanish-American guns from the Spanish-American War, some guns in cement placements as kind of ornaments in the front of that little park there in front of the church. So that hadn't changed, but the base, Subic Bay at that time, was a going concern. I mean, it was handling aircraft carriers, and it was a different place than it was during the war because it had been pretty well savaged by the Japanese, and us, the CB construction crews went in and then rebuilt it. And of course, the Quonset huts were gone, and the barracks that were built out of plywood and 2x4s were gone, and there were some buildings of more permanent character when we were there.
Yeah. Did you, while you were there, you obviously heard about the news of the war ending in Europe and the impending. Yeah. What was the reaction, and what do you remember about those events?
We were grateful because there was some feeling, I think, among the men there that the resources we needed to fight the battle in the Pacific were being diverted to Europe. And after the war, I found out that was true, that the decision had been made before Pearl Harbor, that if another conflict arose in the Pacific, it would be Europe first. And I think that, from my reading, of course, at this point, was because President Roosevelt and General Eisenhower were aware of the atrocities of Auschwitz and other places, and they were determined that we had to stop that as fast as we could. And so I think that after the war, I did not feel that we were being in any way shorted. But while I was there, I think there were some feelings, particularly among the Marines, that some of the equipment that they wanted to have was in short supply because it was being used in Europe. And we understand that now, but I think at the time, the guys on the line weren't so sure about why that would be happening.
Well, when it's impacting you in the immediate, it makes a big difference.
That's exactly right,
yes. So you continued to do your job after. Had things changed any after the European War was over with, as far as your job's concerned?
Not really.
Not really. Things pretty much went on the same.
Just the same way. It was a service that we were providing. It was a supply, basically. It wasn't logistics, but it was close. It was repair.
Right.
We repaired all kinds of things. It even went to the point where sometimes you couldn't get the part. And the guys in the machine shop would have a casting made of brass or bronze or whatever, and then machine it so that it would fit. So they were literally making parts that today you would just go off the shelf and get one.
Yeah.
But they were not available when you're, like 4,000 miles away. You can't order by Amazon and get it the next day. So that they literally made parts to fit things.
Yeah, you make do with what you have to do with how you do it.
For a short time, I was on the IX-109 USS Antelope, which we were involved in decommissioning. The Antelope had been torpedoed in the Marianas, and it was a Liberty ship, and it was a supply ship. It had been torpedoed, and they brought it into with timbers and plywood, and welded some steel plates on it, hoisted out all the broken turbines and engines and so on. So just towed it around as a supply ship. And I was on it for probably 2 or 3 months after we had finished the LST thing. And I was the mail orderly. And one of the things the mail orderly does is he goes to the beach every day, and we had an LCVP attached to us to get the mail. And the officer aboard the ship, Lieutenant J.G., was tired of our walking, so we ran the LCVP up on the deck, up on the ground, close to the post office. We went over, picked up a Jeep, and drove it back over, put it on our LCVP, took it back out of the ship, hoisted it aboard the ship, repainted it, and printed out USS Antelope IX-109 on the front underneath the windshield. And that was our Jeep for the rest of the time I was there, and I don't know how long it stayed there.
Wow.
But I don't know whose Jeep it was, but somebody came back, I'm sure, to get his Jeep, and it was gone. But I think that happens in wartime.
Yeah.
You borrow government equipment from one unit to the other, sometimes without necessarily filling out all the paperwork.
Yeah.
I still feel that I was involved in some larceny there. I stole a car.
Yeah.
But that was the way things were being done.
I've heard a lot of those similar stories from Marines, more so. But that's good. So when you left there, what was your process of leaving, and you thought you were going to be discharged?
Well,
Mr. Bouchette's here.
Okay, I'll be done this. Thank you. Your process of leaving
Oh.
and of getting out of there and then ending up.
Well, it was very
to a
interesting
state
because
site.
I went back to, they sent me back to Chicago to be discharged because that's where I had entered. I called my parents who lived about 50 miles away. We'd been there a couple of days getting all that processing paperwork done. And 10 o'clock one morning I said I would be ready to leave. And they drove our old car up to the gate. I walked out of the gate, hugged my sister and mom and dad, got in the car, and we drove home. That was my homecoming. My real homecoming, from my point of view, was though I was on an honor flight from here to Washington. We landed at Baltimore, and there were about 30 of us, of course, half of the guys had to be in wheelchairs or with walkers. There were 3 or 4 of us that were ambulatory. And we waited at the farthest gate out because we needed so many wheelchairs.
Yeah.
Finally, we had enough wheelchairs, and we started down the ramp towards the main terminal. And someone, bless their heart, had gone down that causeway, or what would you call it, branch, you know what I'm talking about, the hallway back, and passed out American flags. And people who were in the various waiting areas to board planes came out to the walkway and clapped and applauded, and I thought that was my homecoming, really my homecoming from my years of service, which wasn't very long.
Yeah.
But it took over 60 years
Yeah.
before it happened, because when guys came home previously, I think that they didn't come back as units, they came back as individuals.
Yeah.
And today we send them as units and bring them back as units, and I think the sense of returning to society because they come back as units is sound. It's a good way to do it.
Yeah. How was your after you were discharged, and what do you reflect on your military service? Were you proud to have served in the military during World War II?
Those 2 years changed my life. There's no doubt about it. I don't know that I'd have gone to college. That was not part of the heritage of my family. I was the first one in my whole family that had the opportunity to go to college. I went to college, and the college education allowed me to have a career. I was an elementary school teacher, elementary school principal, college and university president. That's where I finished my career. All those things were made possible because of education, and the GI Bill gave me the opportunity to do that. So I gave 2 years, but I got a whole lot more back, a whole lot more back. And I'm indebted to the U.S. government for having given me a chance to have a full life. And so,
sounds very good. What university were you associated with, or universities?
Concordia University in Nebraska.
Okay.
Small liberal arts school, about 40 miles west of Lincoln. But after that, I had then became a consultant to universities that were in distress, small liberal arts universities, and I served at 5 or 6 of them on a short-term basis. In fact, for one, I was on for about 15 months as a chief operating officer because they were in such fiscal distress.
Yeah.
And so I had learned how to do that. So that.
Is there any last things about your service that you haven't mentioned, or any stories that pop up that we haven't talked about?
Well, there were many, of course. I guess, though, that that first Christmas, and I was in the Philippines and went out on the dock, and I had always celebrated Christmas with a family. And this time, of course, there was no family. But the chaplain had done a good job in a Christmas Eve service. I walked out of the dock, and the fellows were in their exuberance off the ships that were there in the harbor being repaired, found ammunition for tracers, and they lit up the sky with tracers that were peace tracers. You know, there was no war there, but there was exuberance in terms of the fact that the war was over, and we were celebrating Christmas, albeit many miles from home.
Yeah, that's a good story.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your service,
Well, thank
and
you.
thank you for doing an interview with us.
It was an honor to be in the service. It truly was. I think it changed my life. It made me a man, I think, from a boy. And I think that the opportunity that many young men should take, or women should take, to move out of high school adolescence into manhood or womanhood is something to be, I think, revered and thought highly of.